all these years, man has misrepresented who God is in so many ways. God loves everyone and accepts them as they are. And the people who ran these schools were not in any way, shape, or form representing who my God is. God's kingdom is about justice and freedom. It wasn't about what these nuns and these priests brought to our people. They were wrong. Thank you.
Okay, mesdames et messieurs, everyone, merci beaucoup pour la pause. Je vais vous demander de vous asseoir. I'm going to ask you all to grab a seat. Sit down. Find a way to calm yourselves. Calmez-vous. Ask you to also let me know if Alvin Tully is here. We're going to ask Alvin now to come forward. He's going to join us. I'm going to ask you all to take a seat, please. I'm going to ask you to end your conversations. Finissez vos discours. While Alvin is getting ready, is Paul Saint-Aubin arrived? Is he back there? Paul Saint-Aubin? Paul Saint-Aubin? Est-ce qu'il y est? No, il n'est pas arrivé. Does anyone know if Paul Saint-Aubin has arrived? If not, then we may be able to take some people off of the wait list. So those of you who are on the wait list, Lucy Tuklepik and Kenneth Wisch, if I'm pronouncing that right, I hope, we may be able to call upon you, so be ready. But for now, we have Alvin Tully. Alvin?
Miigwech, thank you, merci. My name is Alvin Tully. I'm a survivor of residential school. I spent approximately 8 years in school, and I attended 2 schools, one in Spanish and one in Kenora, Ontario. My number was number 35. Today I want to talk to you about when we were taken away from the community. I want to talk about the Indian agent. What was his role? Because under the Indian Act, how it was established was June Confederation, one member of Parliament asked, what do we do with the Indians? We know today that the word Indian is the wrong word, but it's a legal word. Today we're called different names. We're also called Aboriginals, Indigenous people. Back to Parliament, a member of Parliament asked the House what do we do with the Indians? And the discussion was open. Then it came to the decision that they would establish a Department of Indian Affairs. From that, they said that they would appoint in each community reserve would be an Indian agent. And we know from past experience that the Indian agent never fulfilled its responsibility. Actually, the Indian agent was very cruel, harsh treatment to our ancestors. But anyways, the Indian agent was there to protect us under the Indian Act, which they never did. That is another case that hasn't been resolved. From the Indian agent, when we were, use the word picked up, apprehended, there was also the priests played the role with the Indian agent. Also, to make sure that we went, it was the RCMP were also there. Basically, they had these marching orders from Parliament that our parents had no say. And we can't blame our parents because that was under the Indian Act. A couple of years back when this residential school started, we organized an organization called OURS, the Organization of United Reborn Survivors. We wrote a paper, it's called The Federal Rules of Engagement, the War Against the Churches and the Survivors. The churches were very happy when they saw this because the feds were after them at this point. But along the way, deals were cut with the churches and the feds. I want to touch justice, Canadian justice. There are approximately, in our organization, make a correction here, there's approximately 80,000 survivors. Out of the 80,000 survivors, there's 391 opted out at the AIP. And the understanding that I have is that the 391 are the only ones can go to the federal court. All the rest, it's been sealed, compensations have been paid. That's under the Canadian justice system. The Canadian justice system, there is approximately 6,000 federal lawyers. Out of that 6,000, there's 1,000 out in the field. The odds are against us as First Nations. At the time when the feds came to pick us up, it was under the federal responsibility. And as of today, foster care now it's under provincial law. Our kids are being ended again under the provincial system. There are more kids now in the provincial system that are taken away from Native families than the residential school. We're reliving the history that happened to us. This system under the provincial should be under the federal, because that's where it all started. Along the way, we got dumped. And now, how to resolve this to make a final closure for all the survivors and our children. Today, I would like to mention to the world that Canada is to be tried under the Genocide International Court. Under the UN definition of genocide, forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. This is what's happened. Canada is responsible for this. When we talk about justice, we talk about government. So what we need to go ahead with this forward, we need lawyers that specialize in human rights under the international law. To have a true reconciliation, we are asking justice from the international courts to resolve Canada's genocide. A lot of the survivors asked me about different governments in Canada. The newest one is the New Democratic Party. And then we also have the Liberals, the Conservatives. And from my experience, they're all the same. Canada, with all these lawyers, write up agreements, even in the comprehensive land claims, different policies to extinguish our rights. That's not right. I, as an Aboriginal person, I cannot go in your house and say I'm taking it over tomorrow. This is what's being done in Canada. I want the world to notice. We need the support with the new system of electronics that we have today to help us. Also, in closing, I want to say I was talking to my psychologist, and she told me, Alvin, it's going to take years and years to get healed, and it's going to be passed on to our children. I want to thank the chair, Mr. Sinclair, for giving us this opportunity to come forward and to talk to you. I have attended a lot of meetings in my life, and I know that the people that are sitting here have interests, one way or another. And I want to say from my deepest heart, I say to you, miigwech, merci, thank you.
Whenever you're ready.
My name is Catherine Sorby, and as you can see, my hat is on my head and not in my hand with my head bowed. I'm here as a proud Mi'kmaq person, an Aboriginal person, and I'm to relate my story. It's quite long, but I only have 14 minutes and 40 seconds to tell you. Well, my experience is 50 years long, and I wanted to speak on the probably a political agenda that goes on within the Canadian government, starting from the Indian residential schools. And I believe that if this reconciliation truth and reconciliation is to be recognized, we must acknowledge the goings-on of the politics of Canada. And in my 50 years, I have witnessed many injustices in all departments of the Canadian politics, from social services to justice, to education, to health, to housing. I can go on. And I've not been too happy with it. Not been too happy with it at all, watching our people suffer at the hands of professionals, supposedly professional colonials. I can never say that word, it just sticks in my throat. Because I somehow make more sense in my own Mi'kmaq language. As soon as I speak English, I kind of fuddle up like the government does. Anyway, my story is that exactly, the injustices. Now, I went through the healing, I went through so many programs in 50 years. I have been categorized, I have been numbered, I have been sometimes accepted, most of the time rejected. But, and I've dealt with many agencies, and the worst one I've dealt with so far was this residential school settlement. You know, Canada patted itself on the back for giving the Indians, you know, the Aboriginals, the survivors, $2 billion something. And I'm still pissed off about it. You know? Because nobody wants to mention the results of these. I went through the process. It was not a nice process. ADR brought out the worst of the lawyers. They came out like cockroaches to represent our people and take 85% of their things, of their monies, and the rest of it was spent by the Canadian government. I believe the Canadian government made in years one of the biggest job creations for all Canadians out of this residential school money. And then the lawyers, oh my God, what they got out of it. We're the ones who went through the system and live it daily, and we will live with it for the rest of our lives. And they get paid millions. You know, that money could have went to the homeless. I don't care if I got any money. I got money. They awarded me, I'll tell you, I was supposed to keep it a secret, but the hell with them. It's gone. I received 104,000 point something, and out of that, the lawyer was kind to me. He claimed he only took 20%, which he was supposed to take 30%. Then the government took the rest, almost $25,000 in taxes. I was left with like 81,000 or something like that, and it was gone in 4 days. Yeah, gone in 4 days. Because I didn't do it for the money. I did it to see what the government's going to do with me now. And the other injustice is that the people who have not spoken up yet, who are still silent about their pain and about their experiences, that haven't come forward, who are now just coming out and wanted to get their CEPs, they're not allowed to get them. There was a deadline. They missed the deadline. It's like they died. They were supposed to have died before their deadline, so they don't get nothing. And then those who went and applied for ADR, Some shyster lawyers got a hold of them, and some of them literally got money. One got disbarred, and the other took off for the States with the money they got for these poor survivors, and survivors got nothing. And that's a fact. Now, these survivors cannot reapply because their lawyers already settled for them. So there's so many injustices going on, and ignorance by our people, and trusting. They're too trusting. Actually, sir, they're very trusting. And this is the truth of the matter. And then our own lawyers, in my case, just because I didn't come out with my sexual abuse for a while after, at my adjudication meeting, my lawyer actually turned to me and said, "Oh, I didn't hear about your sexual abuse for so many years." I said, "You never looked in my file where I wrote it." I says, "You gave me a phone number to contact the RCMP, and the number you gave me, every time I call it, is no longer in service." So I said, "Sir." Then he pushed me on to his assistant. So I went to the assistant, and me being who I am, an Aboriginal person who has we all have a sense of humor. If we didn't have a sense of humor, we wouldn't survive. You know that. We laugh at things that other people would take to heart and strangle you. You know? But as Aboriginals, we stayed, you know, we make fun of it. It's not a big deal. We don't make a mountain out of a molehill. And that's why Indian residential school was such a dark cloud over Aboriginal nations for so long, because we kept it to ourselves, the pain and the anger. Well, anyway, getting back to my story, he sends me to another lawyer. So I start to tell him my story, and he starts laughing. So naturally, I get very angry. I know you're not supposed to use words like pissed off, I guess, but I really was, you know. That's speaking English. That's the word that comes to me, pissed off, you know. So I got so pissed off, I lifted the desk that he was sitting on, and I said, "You think my life is a joke? You think my life is a joke? You don't understand," I says. "You're dealing with our people, our Aboriginal people. You don't think we have feelings, a heart, a mind? And you're my attorney?" So I wanted to address that because it's still going on. There were so many survivors refused under the IAP program because they called me personally. I have a list of 345 people that were not accepted under the IAP. And they don't know what to do about it, simply because their colonial lawyers told them they weren't eligible under the conditions of this, 19 steps that you have to have suffered? How much pain you went through, how many degrees of pain you went through. Honest to God, that's what all this thing was about. Degrees of everything. Degrees of sexual abuse. It's like if you had 5 or 10 vaginas or rectums, to how many degrees you were degraded. And if you weren't degraded enough, if you fell in a certain category, you only got so much. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't, does it? And I'm still pissed. Then another thing was the amount of abuse, not just sexual, but physical, emotional, and it was done in degrees. It's like taking a temperature. If your temperature is so many degrees, you have a fever. Well, how high do your feelings have to be hurt? How deeply to be compensated? That's how they did the charts. You know that most of you went through that system, and some of you think I'm talking bullshit. But I'm not, because a lot more didn't make it. A lot more didn't settle for that. Since they didn't want to settle for the way of their thinking, they were rejected. And it's for those people that I'm speaking that I dared to come up here today and mention this, that there are a lot more people who did not get compensation simply for the reasons that I told you, and they're afraid. I have foster children, 7 of them, and 2 of them told me they were sexually abused, and they would never mention it to anybody else. Not to the governments, not to the lawyers, not to anybody, because to be degraded all over again. And that's how I felt. And on top of that, the Canadian government turns around after apologizing, talking about truth and reconciliation, and then at these meetings, they send strong-arm lawyers. Strong-arm lawyers to refute what you're saying and to doubt it and to make light of it and to cut down the cost it's going to cost the government. Now, do you think that's fair? Well, I'm telling you, it's going on. And is that the truth and reconciliation of this country for our Aboriginal people? No, it isn't. Not at all. Has never been, and I'm sorry to say it's going to take a lot more of us speaking out and make these politicians become humane. Shame on them is right. I got 1 minute and 7 seconds. You think I've said enough? 55 seconds. Okay. So anyway, so those are my beeps. I don't cry anymore too much. Oh, I'm lying. I just cried a little while ago in the other room with a gentleman from Rwanda about their genocide and watching their, what the colonial system does, not just to our nations, but to other countries, Aboriginal people. And I think it has to come from us. We have to speak out. We can no longer have our hats in our hands with our head bowed. So I'm telling you, this hat was placed and it's going to stay there and nobody's going to knock it off. I love you all. I love you all so much. And I share your pains and I share your sorrows. And I try to keep up with all our Aboriginal people, what goes on. I'm not just being nosy. I really care. And I would just love for the rest of Canada to learn from us, to learn the peace and gentleness that we can have. and how we were before they came off the boats. Before I sign off, I'll tell you a story. You know, the Mi'kmaq of the East, we were told anyway that that's where the first boats were. So along came the ship, Sachpulka, Blasulka, Shkua, Saramau Garamito. The chief was there with Wigamams, with his people. Ankatimidijla, Blasulka, Shkua, watching the sailboat, big sails on it coming closer, and Elabito, Saramau, the grand chief was looking. And the people on the boat were scurrying around inside, you know, looking for something to give to the Saramau, to give to the leader of these people. So they found a hat, you know, the old hats of the, with the plumes on it, you know, so they find that and they give it, take it, and the captain says, oh, Gabidan Deluit, captain says, oh, we'll give him this hat. So they row on their small little boats and row to shore. They got to the shores, and one of them runs out and gives the hat to the Saramau, gives the hat to the chief, and I was nigging much. So chief takes it good-naturedly and puts it on, turns around to his people. Welcome. Do I fit it? That's what it means in Mi'kmaq. Welcome. And the captain jumps up and down and says, he's welcoming us. He's welcoming us. So that's when the trouble began, because of a hat. Not bad, eh? Is that right? Thank you. Walalio. Walalio. Tawalo. Walalio. Now I'll stand for you. Thank everybody, and take to heart, just be who you are, accept who you are, respect who you are, but don't forget to respect others. This is our Aboriginal way. Okay? Any colonialism you've learned, try and unlearn it. Thank you.
There goes a strong woman, huh? Strong grandmother, strong auntie, strong mother. I'm going to bring the presentations to a close now. Those who are left on the list, Paul Saint-Aubin, and those who are on the waiting list, we're going to ask you to speak to the organizers about giving a private statement. We have room for you to give private statement. So we're going to ask if you would address your statements in that way to us, because I'm going to now take the last few minutes of our time until 3:30 in order to summarize not just what I've heard here today, but the other things that come from the presentations that we've had as commissioners. Those of you who've been in this session this afternoon, I'm sure have been in other sessions here, as well perhaps as in other sessions at some of our other events. And you know that we hear the full gamut, the full range of stories and experiences and thoughts that people have about what it meant to have a residential school system and to be in it in the time that it was here. But the one consistent thing that we have heard from all of the presenters who have been here among us was that it should never have been done in the way that it was done if it was to have been done at all. In some of the other communities that we've been in, they talk about the treaties that were negotiated with the government shortly after 1870. And in those treaties, there are specific clauses that talk about the government having to establish schools right on the reserves, right in the communities where the people resided, so that those schools would educate those children from those communities locally. Those clauses were never fulfilled until well after the residential schools had been in place and had done their damage. The consistent thing we've heard about the schools from all of the presenters that have spoken to us has been about the damage that the schools have done, not only to them but to others. Even those who speak to us and have presented to us the experiences they've had in the schools, who indicate that they themselves have not experienced physical or sexual abuse, nonetheless talk to us about the fact that they did experience the isolation that the schools created, the sense of imprisonment, the sense of separation from their families and the distance from their communities. And not only distance in terms of mileage, but also distance in terms of cultural separation, because the schools were not about education. In fact, if you really think about it, one could argue that the Indian residential school system was Canada's child welfare system for Indians. The intent being, of course, to take away children from their parents in order to indoctrinate them into a different way of being. That indoctrination that was intended by the schools occurred in large numbers, and we have heard from presenters who talked to us about their loss of language, their loss of culture, and their loss of identity. And we know that that loss is a significant loss. Whether or not they suffered physical injury, the loss of those things is a significant loss. But it is a loss that people have a hard time valuing, hard time understanding the value of it. One of our obligations as a commission is to get Canada to understand that what was lost has value. What was lost is important. And that just as though those who were in this country were forced to be indoctrinated into another culture or another society, would feel a sense not only of violation but of loss of those things that were taken from them, so too do those survivors who went to the residential schools feel that same loss. And we have heard eloquent presentations here today about what that sense of loss means. We've also heard, of course, in the proceedings that we have had, many comments about the agreement itself and whether the agreement was a fair agreement and whether the process of implementing that agreement was a fair process. And we have identified to us and had identified to us by survivors and others the problems concerning the implementation of the settlement agreement. And it is our intention as commissioners to talk about those things, all of the things that we have heard here today, that we have heard in other communities, and that we ourselves have discovered through our own research and our own studies. We intend to talk about those things in our report because it is part of the truth, the full and complete story of residential schools in this country. And And what is important is that at the end of the day, that truth be the foundation for answering the question that is so very important to all of us, and that is, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? Because we have to do something about this. We have to take some action about all of this. And now the question becomes, knowing all that we know, knowing all that we will know, what should we do about this? And that engages us in a discussion and a dialogue about reconciliation and what reconciliation means. And I've heard many comments from the presenters today and from other presenters as well about the relationship between reconciliation and forgiveness. And I don't want anyone to think that as commissioners we endorse the idea that one has to forgive in order to have a situation of reconciliation, because personally I'm not convinced that you do. I know that in other jurisdictions, in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, there was a very strong emphasis upon the need for victims of violence to forgive their perpetrators in order to be able to achieve reconciliation. But as one of the spiritual advisors that we have advising us at the Commission pointed out, how do you forgive a government? How do you forgive a church? He said, it's like forgiving a car that runs you down. You can't forgive the car. It's the driver that you need to talk to. It's the driver you need to hear from. It's the driver who has done the wrong, not the car. The government did not do the wrong. It's the people who ran the government who did the wrong. They used the government and the laws that governments can create and the policies that they can implement to do the wrong. And while there are people today who are driving that car, the same car, they're not the ones necessarily who did the wrong. But if they continue to do wrong today, then they must be held accountable for those wrongs. But those past wrongs that our relatives who have spoken to us in these hearings have suffered, they're perpetrated by an institution, some say, but in reality they have been perpetrated by individuals, some of whom are no longer with us. In fact, many of whom are no longer with us, are no longer alive. And if we insist that they have to somehow forgive those people, then I think we would be doing them a disservice. We would be re-victimizing our survivors today if we demand that they have to forgive. And I don't think that's right. It's much like a domestic family situation. There is a great deal of parallel between domestic violence, family violence, and this kind of violence that we see in residential schools. The parallel being that it is all about individuals. And if the individuals who have been identified as being the wrongdoers and the individuals who have been identified as being the victims can come together and find a way of reconciling those acts and their feelings about those acts together, then as a commission we would encourage that. We would facilitate that if we could, if we were asked to. We would help to make it happen if they both wanted it to happen. But as many have told you here today, it takes two to reconcile. It's hard to reconcile with somebody who refuses to take responsibility for what it is that they have done. And therefore, reconciliation and forgiveness don't necessarily have to coexist. They're not interdependent. They can be connected, but they're not interdependent. But reconciliation is about finding a way to be able to move on, finding a way to be able to deal with all of this so that you can move on. And that's the challenge that we face in this country, finding a way to be able to move on, to move forward as a country and as people and as individuals who have experienced these things that we've heard about. Is there a way for us to be able to move on? And if you can't, then what about your children? And what about your grandchildren? is there a way that they can be able to move on? Because they will be living with other children and other grandchildren in this country and future generations. And what kind of relationship do you want them to have? As I said at the beginning of my remarks on the first day of this gathering, both the legacy and reconciliation are complex issues, very complicated issues. But it takes perseverance. It takes some understanding, it takes commitment, it takes hard work in order for us to be able to come to terms with this. I want to extend my thanks to all of the individuals who have made presentations to us here today, in particular to those who have disclosed to us what it was like being in the schools, those who have talked about what it is like being in the homes of survivors, living with their own aspect of the legacy of residential schools, the intergenerational population. The intergenerational survivors, the children of the survivors and the grandchildren of survivors are the ones today who are challenged not just to come to terms with that past, but also to find the solutions for the future.